Story recapped here. Today I'm going to explain a comedy, drama, and fantasy film called Premature. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. While having a sweet dream about a pretty lady on top of him, high school senior Rob Crabb wakes up when his mother, Anne, suddenly enters his room. Anne is embarrassed to see her son with almost no clothes on and asks him to throw the sheets in the laundry. And when she leaves, Rob looks down and realizes why she acted that way. Afterward, Rob gets ready for school and talks to his father, Jim, about his interview for admittance to Georgetown University. Jim gives Rob his old headband from when he rode crew at Georgetown, and he's sure his son will make him proud. On his way to school, Rob shyly greets his schoolmate Lisa, but the girl just ignores him and leaves with her friends. Then, Rob's friend, Stanley, falls from the roof and casually walks up to him with his bicycle, sharing how Lisa gave him a good time. He also tells Rob he loves sleeping with someone, before asking him what he'll do if he fails his interview. However, Rob doesn't mind him and heads to school. Once they're on campus, Rob and Stanley greet their other friend Gabrielle and her smart neighbor Arthur. A teacher, Mr. Hughes, also talks to them, but Arthur asks for money in exchange for making his lesson plan. Then, Arthur advises Rob to drop his name during his interview before leaving with the teacher. Before going to class, Gabrielle and Rob discuss their plans for the night. They want to have some beer while watching the spelling bee, but as they talk, Rob can't help but notice a beautiful girl named Angela. Unfortunately, Rob gets wet when a volleyball player, Tommy, decides to pick on him, and the athlete only becomes annoyed when Stanley calls him out. When the volleyball player leaves with his friends, Rob realizes he's not wet with water, so Gabrielle instructs Stanley to go to the Lost and Found and get Rob a new pair of pants. Gabrielle also reminds Rob to stay calm during his interview, saying everything will be okay before finally heading to her classroom. Moments later, Stanley gives Rob an ugly pair of pants. Then, he tells Rob's tutee to join Arthur at the other table despite the tutor's protests. After that, he advises Rob to go to the restroom to pleasure himself while thinking of Angela, who's just walked into the library. Angela approaches them and talks to Rob, asking him if they could schedule an emergency tutoring session at her house that night. However, Rob declines because he's supposed to meet Gabrielle in the evening, making Angela sad. Of course, Stanley intervenes and tells Angela that Rob will reassess his schedule and get back to her. Angela appreciates that, and before she leaves, she compliments Rob's coat. Afterward, Stanley persuades his friend to meet with Angela that night and bail on Gabrielle, but Rob refuses. Then, during class, Rob gets called to the main office, and Stanley draws on his interview notes. In the hallway, Rob explains to Gabrielle why he's only wearing gym shorts and walks with her. Rob is nervous about his interview, but Gabrielle is certain he'll nail it. During his interview, Rob apologizes to the interviewer, Jack Roth, about his shorts. Luckily, the man doesn't mind, and he also doesn't see what's drawn on Rob's notes when he crumples the paper. Jack tells Rob to answer his questions honestly, but he suddenly cries when he remembers his late wife. Still, Jack tries to continue with the interview, sobbing as he asks Rob about his tutoring and talking about the woman he loves. Unsure about what to do, Rob gives Jack his father's headband, which the guy uses to wipe his nose. Moments later, Rob informs Stanley he failed his interview. However, Stanley says he can still get into Georgetown, adding that if he can't, he should just focus on Angela. So Rob approaches Angela and tells her he can tutor her, before canceling his plans with Gabrielle and saying he's not feeling up to it. Rob feels bad for lying to Gabrielle, but Stanley doesn't really care about that. Instead, Stanley wants Rob to think about his night with Angela, and they spend a couple of minutes deciding which rubber to buy. Unfortunately, Rob gets hit by a car on his way to Angela's place, but the driver doesn't help him and just speeds away. Upon reaching Angela's house, Rob gets confused when he sees a man smoking on the porch. The guy, Uzi, asks him if he's there for women, so Rob says he's Angela's tutor. Then, Angela comes out and invites Rob to her room, asking him to sit on the bed. When Angela touches Rob's thigh, he suddenly jerks and causes her to spill wine on her top. Because of that, Angela changes her clothes and confesses she only asked Rob to tutor her because she likes studying with him. Eventually, Angela kisses Rob, but when the girl puts her hand in his pants, he finishes early. Strangely, Rob wakes up in bed at the exact moment when his mother walks in on him. Rob is unsure how that happened but proceeds to get ready for school, only to be more confused when his father talks to him about his interview later that day. Once again, his father gives him his old headband, and Lisa ignores him for the second time. Then, Rob touches Stanley's face when he shares the same story about Lisa, leaving his friend puzzled. Once they get to school, Rob observes his surroundings and notices the same things that happened the previous day are happening again. However, this time, he manages to avoid Tommy when the guy first tries to hit him with a water gun before eventually getting wet. He then says he'll just wear his gym shorts when Gabrielle asks Stanley to go to the Lost and Found to find him a pair of pants. In the library, Rob tells Stanley he had a dream about that day and adds that Angela wants to sleep with him. As if on cue, Angela walks up to them and asks Rob to tutor her in the evening. He also shares with Stanley in class that he failed his interview and ruined his time with Angela, and during his interview, he only watches Jack cry. After that, Rob goes to the clinic and explains to the nurse what's happening to him, only to leave when one of the patients suddenly throws up. Then, Rob receives a text and realizes he didn't cancel his plans with Gabrielle before buying a rubber with Stanley. Unfortunately, he also gets hit by a car again, and he sees Uzi watching him with Angela as he finishes prematurely. For the second time, everything that happened the other day repeats from the start. Then, he manages to avoid the car that hit him, only to be hit by another one. At the same time, he still finishes early with Angela, and he can't help but feel frustrated when he wakes up in his bed. Because of that, Rob goes to Stanley's house and finds Lisa there. Then, upon learning about Rob's dream, Stanley says his chastity is driving him crazy. Rob is scared because everything feels too real, and that's when Lisa points out it sounds like a delusional disorder and adds he just needs some antipsychotic pills. However, Stanley thinks Rob will be fine once they sleep with Lisa at the same time, but the girl simply refuses. Lisa then tells the boys to finish before leaving, and just like that, Stanley and Rob feel the earth move. When Anne walks in on Rob again, she immediately tells her husband what's going on with their son. Rob hears everything and tries to think about his recurring dream, and when he realizes what happens after he finishes, he takes his laptop and goes to an adult site. Of course, he finishes prematurely again, so when his mother enters his room, he tells her he'll start doing his own laundry. At school, Rob rushes to talk to Gabrielle, who wonders why he's dressed casually for his interview. Rob then tries to tell Gabrielle his problem, but when Tommy shoots him with a water gun again, he totally loses it and breaks the athlete's toy. Gabrielle immediately stops him, but Rob is too pissed and calls out the volleyball players for their poor behavior. He also insults them by calling them gay, only to learn that Tommy is actually into guys. Unfortunately, the athletes get offended when Rob mocks their sport, so they chase him through the hallways. As Rob runs, he tells Angela he can't tutor her before locking himself in a classroom. However, the guys eventually find him, and after seeing something written on a chair, Rob decides to pleasure himself. The athletes can't believe what Rob is doing, but when he finally finishes, he wakes up in his bed and ignores his mother. Despite feeling embarrassed, Rob is happy that nothing happened to him. Before going to school, Rob asks his father why he wants him to go to Georgetown, so Jim says that's where he met Anne, and upon hearing that, Rob tells him he doesn't need a pep talk for the interview and leaves. Then, Stanley and Gabrielle can't help but notice the changes in Rob's behavior once they greet each other in school, but they just try to ignore him. Moments later, Rob takes a golf cart into the hallway, feeling like he can do whatever he wants. Then, when the hall monitor stops him, Rob asks a girl sneaking out of her classroom to kiss the guy just so he can continue having fun. He also invites Gabrielle to join him smoke on a school bus, where they talk about how they became friends. Afterward, Rob uses the restroom in the teacher's lounge and leaves Mr. Hughes disgusted. He then gives good advice to Jack during his interview and lets the guy drive away in the golf cart, making Stanley worried about him. So Rob reveals to Stanley that he already told him what's happening to him days ago, and he makes sure his friends will see him grab his teacher's chest. In the cafeteria, Rob punches a girl, Sally, for what she did to him when they were kids. Unfortunately, Sally retaliates, and it isn't long before Rob finds himself lying on the floor and repeatedly getting hit. Running out of options, Rob grabs Sally's chest when Stanley tells him to, so the girl kicks him in the groin several times. Because of what happened, Rob is taken to the office of Principal Hansen. The principal tells Rob the cops are coming for him, recounting what he did to Sally, the teacher, and even the hall monitor. Principal Hansen also informs Rob his parents are on their way to school, leaving the boy desperate to escape his situation. With no other choice, Rob grabs the mayonnaise on the table and starts pleasuring himself, and he immediately runs outside when the principal sees what he's doing. Seconds later, Stanley saves Rob from Sally and takes him to the girl's locker room. He instructs Rob to hide in one of the stalls, and Rob immediately pleasures himself to restart his day. Unfortunately, Rob struggles to finish and tells Stanley he has to do it without explaining why. So Stanley tries to help him by talking to him like a girl, but Rob soon realizes it's pointless and decides to turn himself in. However, Sally kicks Rob in the groin before he can leave, and strangely, that gets the job done. When Rob wakes up in his bed, he curses so loud that his mother thinks he's talking to her. Then, he goes to school in a bad mood, cancels his plans with Gabrielle, and ignores Mr. Hughes and Tommy when he bumps into them. Stanley can only try to support his friend and says he'll do anything for him, so Rob hugs his buddy and feels a bit better. After that, Rob agrees to tutor Angela in the evening. He then gets called to the main office for his interview, but Gabrielle isn't waiting in the hallway for him this time. Unfortunately, Rob doesn't feel like answering Jack's questions and deliberately blows his chance to get into Georgetown. That night, Rob visits Gabrielle at home and reveals what's really happening to him. Sadly, Gabrielle doesn't believe Rob and asks him to tell her about his recurring dream again the next day. Also, she instructs Rob to mention her fantasy about Abraham Lincoln to make her realize he's telling the truth. Then, she suggests asking Arthur for help and goes to his house with Rob, where the boy's grandmother attacks Rob while shouting the word Jadugar. When Rob loses his balance, he accidentally falls on top of Arthur's grandmother and renders her unconscious. However, the old woman isn't done yet and comes at Rob again, so Arthur's mother and Gabrielle put themselves in between her and the boy. At the same time, Arthur's mother keeps bumping into Rob, and it isn't long before he finds himself in his bed again. At school, Rob forces Arthur to help him with his problem and follows him to the restroom. There, he shoves Arthur's head into the toilet bowl and asks what Jadugar means, so the boy says he thinks it means curse. Then, Rob demands to know how to break it, but Arthur says he has no idea how to help him. After letting Arthur go, Rob reveals to Gabrielle and Stanley that he's cursed. He also tells them his day will just keep repeating and mentions Gabrielle's dream about Abraham Lincoln, adding that he already told her about his problem the previous night. Meanwhile, Stanley points out that a curse is the universe trying to make one person right a cosmic wrong. He then advises Rob to figure out what made the curse start and fix it. With that, Rob realizes he needs to deal with Angela. Moments later, Rob tells Angela in front of her classmates that he'll tutor her in the evening, leaving Gabrielle disappointed. Then, he asks Stanley to teach him how to please a woman before going to Angela's house and making out with her. Unfortunately, Rob soon realizes that Angela only wants him to do her assignments for her, and it also dawns on him that he's not supposed to be there. Outside, Rob finds his father waiting for him and learns that he knows he failed his interview. Jim then takes his son to a hotel to meet with a depressed Jack, who asks him for some scotch. So, Jim briefly leaves to get their drinks, and when he returns, Jack asks him why he wants Rob to go to Georgetown. Without hesitation, Jim says going there was a transformative experience of his life, adding that Georgetown gave him a scholarship. Afterward, Rob gets up to get more drinks and sees a spelling bee on TV. Then, he realizes he likes Gabrielle and confesses to his father that he doesn't want to go to Georgetown. With no other choice, Jim supports his son and prepares to leave with him, and Jack also joins them as they head to Gabrielle's house. A few minutes later, Jack and Jim help Rob enter Gabrielle's room through a window. Rob explains himself to Gabrielle and says he didn't sleep with Angela, refusing to go anywhere when his friends ask him to leave. Pissed, Gabrielle attempts to make Rob finish and removes her shirt just so he'd leave her alone, but her father walks in on them. Embarrassed, Rob quickly clarifies that he's not trying to take advantage of Gabrielle, and the girl eventually puts her shirt back on. In front of Gabrielle's father, Rob admits to Gabrielle how much he likes her. However, Rob is aware that he blew his chance to be with Gabrielle too, and starts leaving through the window. Meanwhile, Gabrielle's father shyly lectures his daughter about being in a relationship, but the girl says she'd be more comfortable talking about it with her mother. Once her father is gone, Gabrielle stops Rob from leaving and asks him to watch a spelling bee with her. They then eventually kiss, and Gabrielle admits that she was always hoping they'd be each other's firsts. It isn't long before they make love to each other, but when Rob finishes, he can't believe that he's still in Gabrielle's bed. Finally, Rob realizes he's broken the time loop, saying he's right where he's supposed to be. At the same time, Gabrielle says they should have done something like that sooner, so they eagerly go for a second round. Later on, Jack interviews Angela and asks why she wants to go to Georgetown, but the girl doesn't even know where that is. Also, Jack isn't sad about his wife anymore and cheerfully says she's already dead.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.